They buried her mother's case. Then the dog came back. There are cases that close too neatly, files that get stamped accident before the bodies are cold. This was one of them. Until a dog reopened everything. Aria Beckett was only 8 when the crash happened. Her parents were declared dead on impact. But questions lingered. Questions nobody wanted to ask. Why were the brakes cut? Who were the men seen following them 2 days earlier? 2 years passed. No answers. No voice from Aria. Then, out of the fog of a winter morning, came a figure. A German shepherd, emaciated, limping, and carrying something no one could ignore, a stained scarf and a military ID belonging to a soldier declared dead. The dog's name was Kairo. He shouldn't have been alive, but he was, and he remembered everything. The wind came in low over the ridge that morning, combing through brittle stalks of prairie grass and rattling the rusted tin roof of the Beckett farmhouse like a memory refusing to be forgotten. Frank Beckett stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the pale Montana landscape. The snow hadn't fallen yet, but it would. He could smell it, sharp, metallic in the air like the breath before a storm. The porch swing creaked once in the wind and fell still again, like everything else in this house. Behind him, the kitchen clock ticked, then ticked again, and again. The rhythm was so familiar it barely registered anymore. That's what time did in this house. It moved, but it didn't change anything. He glanced toward the hallway just as Aria emerged from her bedroom. Same time as always, barefoot in her wool pajamas with the faded fox print, sleeves too short now, hair tangled like the thicket behind the barn. She didn't look at him. She never did. Frank cleared his throat. "Morning, sweetheart." No answer, but she nodded. That was something. She padded silently to the table and sat in the same chair she always did, third one from the window, where the sunlight came in at just the right angle to touch her mother's photograph on the wall. Frank turned back to the stove and poured the oatmeal into 2 bowls. No sugar, just oats, milk, and a half pinch of salt. Aria didn't complain. She never had, not since the accident. As he placed the bowl in front of her, he stole a glance. She was staring out the window. Always out the window. "Supposed to be another cold one today," he said, settling into his chair. "Might even snow before nightfall." Nothing. He reached for his own spoon but didn't lift it. Instead, he looked at her hands, small, pale, trembling slightly, as she crumbled a cracker over her untouched oatmeal. Not for taste, just habit. "Aria," he said gently, "you think maybe, after breakfast, we could go for a walk down by the creek? I could use your company." She didn't look at him, but her fingers paused for a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, then continued crumbling. Frank forced a smile. "Thought I saw deer tracks down there yesterday. Maybe a coyote." Still nothing. 2 years. 2 full years since the wreck. He remembered that night like it had been carved into his bones, the frantic knock at the door, the sheriff's solemn face in the snow, the words he already knew before they were spoken. Single vehicle accident, icy roads, no survivors. Only one survivor, Aria, his only grandchild, the only piece of Jonas and Emily left in this world. And she hadn't said a single word since. After breakfast, Frank washed the dishes while Aria curled up in the living room armchair with the same book she flipped through every morning. She didn't read it. She just held it. The cover had worn soft from her hands. A fairy tale about a girl who tamed a lion with only her silence. There were days Frank thought she might be doing the same, trying to tame the thing inside her. The grief, the fear, the memory of her mother's body shielding hers as the car rolled through snow and steel and silence. The child psychologist had called it selective mutism resulting from acute trauma. Frank called it loss. At night, she'd fall asleep clutching a picture of her parents, creased, tear-stained, always near. Sometimes he'd find her whispering to it in her sleep, words she couldn't say while awake. She never screamed, never cried, just closed up. That afternoon, Frank repaired a broken hinge on the barn door while Aria sat cross-legged in the grass nearby, sketching something in the dirt with a stick. Her boots sat beside her. She never liked wearing them. He pretended not to watch her. She always sensed when he was watching. The wind picked up again. He looked to the sky, low clouds. He could feel it in his knees, the kind of snow that didn't ask permission before falling. Back inside, the house felt colder than it should have. He adjusted the thermostat, though it was working fine. Sometimes the cold wasn't in the air, but in the silence. He moved to the bookshelf, pulled down the photo album, opened to the page with Jonas in his army dress blues, Emily in a summer dress holding baby Aria, her tiny fist tugging at her mother's braid. "Your dad was younger than you'd believe in that picture," Frank said aloud, knowing she wouldn't answer. Didn't know how to change a diaper worth a damn, but he tried. He glanced up. Aria was watching him now, eyes unreadable. Then, without a word, she rose from the armchair and disappeared into her room. As evening fell, the wind returned stronger. Curtains shivered. Wood creaked, and outside, beyond the frost-dusted windows, the ridge faded into mist. Frank lit the old kerosene lamp on the table and sat in his usual spot with the same dog-eared paperback he'd been trying to finish for months. He wasn't really reading, just passing time. Upstairs, he heard Aria's door click shut. Another day survived, another day without a voice. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the flame. "She's still in there, Jonas," he whispered into the silence. "But God help me, I don't know how to reach her." The flame flickered, the wind howled outside, and somewhere beyond the ridge something moved in the dark, drawn by the silence, by the cold, by the scent of something unfinished. The snowfall began sometime after midnight. It came quietly, no wind, no warning. Just a hush that settled over the land like a prayer too old to be spoken aloud. By morning, the world outside the farmhouse had been turned to porcelain. Every fence post, every withered stalk of wheat, every rooftop now wore the same colorless hush. Frank Beckett stood by the kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching as the sky exhaled slow and steady. Snow had always reminded him of deployments, those long white stretches in places too far from home. The cold never used to bother him, not until it settled inside the house. Upstairs, the floor creaked softly, then quiet again. He didn't need to look at the clock to know Aria had woken. She was always precise, like everything in her life now depended on control. Same steps from her bed to the dresser, same pause at the door, same silence. Frank turned back to his coffee, but he didn't drink. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the staircase, half expecting, half hoping to hear something different today. A cough, a yawn, a voice. But silence, like snow, had a way of burying what used to be. When Aria came down, she was holding it again, the photo. Not just any photo, the photo. A glossy 5x7, the edges worn to velvet from 2 years of constant touch. Her mother Emily with wind-tangled hair and a grin so wide it looked painted on. her father Jonas in uniform, arms wrapped tight around them both. And between them, on his shoulders, a laughing little girl with ribbons in her hair and frosting on her nose caught mid-laugh, her joy suspended in time like a song that never got to finish. Aria didn't laugh anymore. She clutched the photograph to her chest like a life vest, sat at the table with it, carried it to the barn when Frank fed the goats, took it to the outhouse, even in the dead of night. Frank had tried once, just once, to take it from her so he could frame it properly. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't cried, she had simply gone still, like glass. He'd backed off, and she hadn't let it go since. After breakfast, he found her curled in the living room, nestled between the cushions of the old green armchair with the photo laid flat across her lap. She traced the image with her fingers, again and again, like she was memorizing the outlines of what was lost. Frank sat down across from her, knees popping in protest. He held a book in one hand but didn't open it. Instead, he watched her, careful not to intrude, but present enough to say, "I'm still here." "Your dad hated that tie," he said softly, pointing at the photo. "But Emily made him wear it for the picture. Said if he didn't, she'd cut it into bookmarks." Aria didn't look up, but her fingers paused, just for a second on the edge of her mother's sleeve. Frank leaned forward a little. "That was the last time they visited Glacier Falls before Jonas got deployed. You remember the hike?" A flicker. Almost nothing. A breath held too long. Aria blinked, then shook her head. Frank exhaled, slow. "That's okay." The room filled with quiet again, the kind that settled deep into the bones. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook, worn, stained at the corners. He flipped to a page dated 2 years ago, the day after the accident. October 19th, Aria still silent. Refuses food unless prompted. Slept with photo again. 3rd night in a row. He didn't read aloud. He didn't need to. Instead, he closed the book gently and looked back at the girl in front of him. So small, yet so heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Outside, the snow thickened. It clung to the windows in soft waves, softening the edges of the world. The pasture vanished into white. The fence disappeared. Even the barn faded, like it had never existed. Frank stood and walked to the front door, pulling on his coat. "I'm going to check the power lines," he said, though he knew she wouldn't answer. "Back in 10. As he stepped outside, the cold bit into his skin, sharp and clean. He stood on the porch a moment, gazing at the endless white. Then he turned back toward the house, and through the frost-bitten window he saw her. Aria, still sitting there, still holding on to a world that had long since slipped away. Inside, she leaned her forehead gently against the photo, eyes closed. The memory came like snowfall, slow, soundless, impossible to stop. Flashback. They were in the back seat of the car, her mom humming off-key, her dad cracking jokes about the moose signs on the highway. She had laughed so hard her ribs hurt. Then the curve, the black truck behind them. Her mother's voice calm but firm. "Sweetheart, buckle up tight." Then the sound. Metal, glass, weightlessness. Her mother's arm across her chest, the smell of blood and burning rubber, her own voice calling out, then nothing, darkness, and then silence. She woke in a hospital bed with bandages around her ribs and a nurse who smiled too much. Frank had been there, eyes hollow, hand trembling as he reached for hers, but the voice was gone. her voice, like someone had taken it when she wasn't looking. So instead, she held on to the photo, because it still heard her, because it didn't ask questions, because it didn't expect anything she couldn't give. Frank returned to find her asleep in the armchair, the photograph pressed tightly to her chest, as if letting go might unravel her completely. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, heart clenched in the quiet ache of it all. She looked like her mother when she slept. The same lashes, the same furrow between the brows when dreaming. He walked over, knelt beside her, and gently adjusted the throw blanket over her small frame. "I'm trying, kiddo," he whispered. "I just don't know how to reach you." The photo peeked out from her hands, just enough for him to see Jonas's tired eyes and Emily's impossible smile. Frank rested his hand over Aria's for a moment, then rose, stepped back into the quiet, and the snow continued to fall, soft, ceaseless, erasing all traces of what had come before. It began as a sound too soft to trust, just a faint, uneven scratching like branches brushing against wood in the wind. Then came the whine, barely audible, rising and falling like a breath caught between pain and persistence. Frank Beckett's eyes snapped open. The room was still dark, faintly lit by the dying embers in the stove downstairs. He reached instinctively toward the nightstand, where the old revolver rested beneath a copy of Field and Stream, but stopped short. The sound wasn't a threat. Not exactly. But it wasn't normal either. He sat up slowly, joints aching from another night spent half sleeping, half listening for nightmares from the room next door. None had come, not lately. Aria had stopped crying in her sleep a few months back. That was when the silence started to feel permanent. The scratching came again, this time louder, more urgent, definitely at the front door. Frank grabbed his flashlight and coat and moved quietly down the stairs, careful not to wake Aria. The floorboards creaked in protest, every sound louder in the pre-dawn hush. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened, turning every surface brittle with frost. He paused at the door. A shape flickered across the frosted glass. Crouching low, Frank flipped on the porch light and froze. There, beneath the pale yellow glow, stood a German shepherd. It looked half ghost, half beast ribs jutting through its fur, coat matted with ice and dirt, one hind leg lifted slightly off the ground as it leaned into the door frame like it had walked for miles and finally collapsed here. Its eyes met Frank's through the glass amber, wide, exhausted but alert. Not wild, not feral. Something else. Frank opened the door slowly. The dog didn't move. It didn't growl, didn't flinch, didn't run. It simply sat there, trembling, its chest rising and falling in ragged heaves. That was when Frank saw it. At the animal's feet lay a bundle of snow-smeared objects, muddy, weather-worn, but unmistakably deliberate. A battered leather wallet, a military ID card half tucked inside, and something else, something that stopped Frank's breath in his throat. A torn strip of floral fabric, soaked through with old blood and frozen stiff. The pattern was unmistakable, cornflower blue and faded yellow daisies. The same pattern Emily had worn that day, the last day. Frank knelt slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog's. What in God's name? He reached for the wallet first, hands trembling. The leather peeled away like skin as he unfolded it. A name, a photo, a rank. Captain Mason Vance, K9 Unit, active duty. Frank swore under his breath. He remembered the name. Vance had gone missing months before the accident. Rumors of desertion, some classified incident at Fort Ridge. But what was his ID doing here? Why now? And why with this dog? The shepherd didn't move, but something in its posture shifted. It looked formal, like a soldier awaiting instruction. Despite its frailty, the dog held itself with dignity, with purpose. Frank's eyes dropped back to the strip of fabric. The blood had turned rust brown, but it was fresh once. His stomach twisted. "Where did you get this, boy?" he whispered. No answer, of course, but the dog's eyes never blinked, never wavered. Behind him, a creak. Frank turned sharply to see Aria at the top of the stairs, barefoot, clutching the railing with one hand and the photograph of her parents in the other. Her eyes locked on the dog, and for a moment just a sliver of one something flickered in her face. Recognition? Hope? He couldn't be sure. She came down the stairs slowly, as if in a trance. The dog didn't move. Aria stood in the doorway now, the photo pressed tight against her chest. Her other hand reached out, just barely, fingers trembling in the cold. The shepherd's tail moved once, not wagging, just acknowledgement. Frank glanced between them, something tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. This wasn't chance. This was something else. The girl, the dog, the fabric, the ID. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Later, Frank would try to piece it together. He'd sit at the kitchen table with the wallet spread out beside an old notepad. He'd write down names, timelines, connections, anything to make sense of how a half-dead military dog could show up in the middle of a snow-covered ranch carrying a fragment of the past they'd been trying to bury for 2 years. But that morning, all he could do was open the door wider. The dog stepped forward slowly, deliberately, and crossed the threshold. It didn't sniff, didn't search, didn't cower. It simply sat on the worn rug near the hearth, where the fire still flickered low. Aria followed without a word. She knelt beside it, laid her photo on the floor, and leaned in until her forehead touched the shepherd's. The dog didn't move. Frank stood frozen, watching the quiet exchange unfold like a ritual he wasn't meant to interrupt. Something ancient passed between them, not quite magic, not quite memory, but something close to both. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping fresh snow against the porch. Inside, for the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel so empty. The morning passed in slow, uncertain rhythm. Frank sat at the kitchen table with the dog's muddy belongings spread across a dish towel, each item thawing in the warmth like frozen truth. The wallet, the folded ID, the rusted tags, and that scrap of bloodied fabric now laid flat under a glass jar, as if containing it could somehow contain the weight it carried. The German shepherd silent as a ghost lay by the hearth, eyes half-lidded but never fully closed. The fire crackled gently, casting gold onto his matted coat. He didn't move unless Aria did, and she hadn't moved since breakfast. She sat cross-legged on the armchair, still in her pajamas, her knees drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped around her father's flannel jacket. The photo, as always, was tucked inside, but for the first time in a long time, her eyes weren't fixed on it. They were fixed on him, the dog, Kairo. That's what Frank had started calling him, at least in his head. It felt wrong to keep thinking of him as the dog when he'd arrived with such purpose. He had a name. Frank was sure of it. And it wasn't luck that brought him here. It was something deeper, Stranger. Intentional. Frank turned the ID card over again in his hands. Despite the smudges and water damage, the details remained legible. Captain Mason Vance, U.S. Army, K-9. Tactical Division Base, Fort Ridge, Montana. The photo on the card showed a square-jawed man in his 30s, buzz-cut, eyes serious, the faintest hint of a smile. Behind him, partially visible, was the same German shepherd lying on Frank's floor. Younger, cleaner, alert. There was a number on the back, military issue. Frank jotted it down, along with the tag number, R207K9. He hesitated, then picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's personal line. It rang 4 times before Sheriff Hal Granger answered, voice thick with sleep and annoyance. "Granger." "Hal, it's Frank." A pause. "Everything all right up there?" "I got a situation I need to talk to you about." Frank glanced toward the fireplace, lowered his voice. "Something showed up on my porch this morning. A German shepherd, military, starving, limping. Brought a wallet belonged to a Captain Mason Vance." Another pause, longer this time. "Frank," the sheriff finally said, "I'm going to need you to slow down. I'm telling you, Hal, this isn't just a lost dog. He had a bloodied scrap of fabric with him, same pattern Emily wore the day she died." Static on the line. Then, "You say Captain Vance?" "Yes. You know him?" "He's, or was, part of a classified K-9 program out of Fort Ridge. Last I heard, he died 6 months ago. Training accident. Official story." "Official story?" Frank asked, jaw tightening. Hal sighed. "Look, Frank, I'll be straight with you. The Army doesn't give us much when it comes to those programs. You find a body, you get a file. No questions. The dog from that unit went missing after the incident. They ran search teams for weeks. Never found it." "Well, it found me," Frank said, "and it brought evidence." "I'll drive up this afternoon," Hal offered. "Take a look myself. You might want to bring someone who understands what these dogs were trained for." Silence. "See you around 3, Hal said, and hung up. Frank set the phone down and rubbed his temple. His mind raced with half-formed questions. If Vance was dead, why did this dog survive? And how did he end up here after all this time with that fabric? He glanced toward the fireplace. Kairo hadn't moved, but his eyes were open now, fixed on Aria, and she was staring right back. Frank had never seen her look at anything that long, not since the accident, not with interest, not with recognition. He watched as she slowly slipped from the chair and knelt a few feet from the dog. She didn't touch him, just sat there, watching, breathing. Kairo raised his head an inch. His ears twitched. Then, to Frank's disbelief, he crawled forward. Just an inch at first, then another, until his nose was just a breath away from her knee. Aria didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her hand and slowly placed something on the rug between them. The photograph, the same one she guarded like it held her heart. The dog sniffed it, once, then twice. He let out a low, almost imperceptible sound, a mix between a sigh and a whimper, and lowered his head beside it. Frank stood frozen at the edge of the room, unsure if he was witnessing grief, memory, or something that didn't belong to language at all. By noon, the snow had started falling again. Kairo had barely moved. Aria had barely blinked. Frank sat at the table with a legal pad, scribbling thoughts that didn't connect. The photo, the ID, the blood-stained fabric. The dog's refusal to leave. Aria's sudden awareness. Her stillness without fear. He flipped to a clean page and wrote 2 words in bold capital letters. "Why here?" At 2:55 p.m., Frank heard tires crunching over frozen gravel. Sheriff Granger's truck. Frank rose, moving toward the door, but paused to glance back. Kairo lifted his head. Aria looked toward the window. They were both waiting. For what, Frank didn't yet know. But something had begun, and nothing in this house would ever be the same again. The crust of a sandwich isn't much, but that morning, in the hush between snowfall and silence, it became something sacred. Frank didn't notice her at first. He'd stepped out to the porch to stack the last few logs by the side of the house, one eye on the sky and the other on the frost-bitten horizon. Sheriff Granger hadn't shown yet. Probably hit snow on the county road. The wind had settled into a moaning rhythm through the pines. A sound Frank had always known meant change. But what changed wasn't out there. It was behind him. When he turned to head back inside, the door was already ajar, and Aria was gone. Panic didn't slam into him. It unfolded slowly, like the thudding of an old heart that hadn't raced in too long. He set the logs down and scanned the field. Then he saw her, a small figure in her oversized coat and snow boots, stepping carefully across the porch with a napkin in her hand. She was headed toward the barn, or rather, toward the shape lying just beyond it. Kairo. The dog was awake but still unmoving, stretched out on the snow-packed ground like a sentinel in quiet meditation. He'd refused to come inside again after his brief moment by the hearth, choosing instead to curl near the edge of the barn's foundation, back to the wind, nose into his paws, watching. He hadn't barked, hadn't whined, hadn't so much as flinched when Frank tried to call him closer earlier that morning. It was as if he'd been trained to wait, and was now waiting for something the rest of them couldn't see. But when Aria appeared, he raised his head, ears perked forward, still didn't move. She walked with hesitant steps, her boots crunching softly in the snow, not running, not hiding, not clutching the photograph. Today her hands held only a napkin-wrapped crust likely from the sandwich she hadn't touched the day before. From the porch, Frank watched with a mixture of awe and unease. She hadn't stepped foot out alone in months. She barely crossed the kitchen without looking over her shoulder. But here she was, 10 paces from the barn now, walking toward a dog who, by every logic, should have frightened her. But she wasn't afraid. If anything, she looked calm. Kairo didn't move. He tracked her with his eyes. When she stopped a few feet from him, she crouched carefully, setting the sandwich crust on the snowy ground. She didn't speak, not at first, just waited. And so did the dog. A minute passed, then another. Then, slowly, deliberately, Kairo rose to his feet. He limped forward, the injury in his back leg still visible, his movements cautious but fluid. The way he approached her held no menace, just a strange, solemn dignity, like he recognized something in her, something buried deep beneath the quiet. Their eyes met, and neither looked away. Kairo lowered his head, sniffed the offering once, then gently took the crust from the ground. He didn't devour it. He chewed carefully, respectfully. Aria, still crouched, watched him. Her hand reached out, not to touch, but to hover inches above his head. Hesitant, vulnerable, brave. She leaned in, her lips moving. Frank couldn't hear the words, but he saw them. A whisper, a secret passed not from child to animal, but from wounded soul to another. Kairo's ears twitched. He looked up at her, not through her, but into her, and then, astonishingly, he sat. Not submissive, not casual, but as if in acknowledgement, like a soldier accepting an oath. Frank stepped off the porch, crunching through the snow as gently as he could, not wanting to startle either of them. Aria didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't care. Her full attention was still on Kairo. When Frank finally reached them, he kept his voice low. "Sweetheart." She looked up at him slowly, and for the first time in 2 years, her eyes were not empty. They were alive, still shadowed, still wary, but awake. He knelt beside her, eyes darting to the dog, who remained seated, gaze flicking from Aria to Frank, then back again. Frank whispered, "What did you say to him?" Aria didn't answer, not with words, but she didn't run, didn't curl inward. She simply stood, brushed snow off her knees, and walked back toward the house. Kairo watched her go, then lay back down, head resting on his paws, still waiting. Back inside, Frank warmed 2 mugs of Cocoa 1 with marshmallows, the way Emily used to make it. He placed it gently beside Aria, who sat at the table now with the photograph once more in hand, but she wasn't clutching it this time. She was looking at it, studying. Her eyes flicked between the image and the window, where the shape of the German shepherd still lingered in view. Frank took a slow breath. Whatever had just happened in that yard, it wasn't simple. It wasn't random, and it wasn't over. The air in the living room was unusually dense. Outside, the snow had stopped, but clouds still pressed low against the sky like a weight no one could shake. Frank sat by the fireplace with the phone clutched to his ear, his free hand tracing the edge of the military ID again and again, as if it might speak if he pressed hard enough. Across from him, Sheriff Hal Granger stood stiffly near the coat rack, hat in one hand, thermos in the other, steam curling from its lid, but untouched. The man hadn't said much since he arrived, just stared at the German shepherd curled outside the window and muttered once, "That's not just any dog." Now a third voice joined the room, the one on speaker. Colonel Derek Ryland, former handler and tactical director of the K-9 Special Recon Unit, Fort Ridge Division. Even through the static of the line, his voice carried command. "You said the ID belonged to Mason Vance? You're absolutely sure?" "I'm looking at it right now," Frank replied. "Wallet, too, dog tags, and a scrap of fabric that came from the scene of my daughter's accident." A beat. "And the dog?" Frank glanced at the window. The shepherd still hadn't moved from his position near the barn, though his eyes watched the house like he already knew what was being said. "He's alive," Frank said. "Barely. Limping, underfed, but alert and calm. He hasn't barked once." "That fits." K-9 R207K9 was trained for deep stealth, recon, and advanced search rescue. Last known deployment was overseas, then domestic for black site testing. "We lost contact with both dog and handler 7 months ago. Officially declared them deceased." "You lost contact?" Granger muttered, speaking for the first time. "You don't lose dogs like that. Not trained ones." "We didn't lose him, Sheriff," Ryland said coolly. "We were told to stop looking." Frank's stomach dropped. There it was again. That sense this wasn't just about a missing dog, or a grieving girl, or even a family's shattered life. Something bigger was bleeding into their quiet world. "What name did he respond to?" Ryland asked. "Do you know it?" Frank hesitated. He looked toward Aria. She'd been sitting silently on the stairs the entire time, curled up with her knees to her chest, the flannel jacket still around her shoulders. She hadn't taken her eyes off the window. Not once. Frank turned back to the phone. "No. He hasn't responded to anything I've called him." something strange happened this morning. He told them about the sandwich crust, about Aria walking out alone, the whisper, the dog's gentle approach. Children who've experienced trauma sometimes form isolated bonds with animals, Ryland said. But if this is that dog and if she spoke to him, I don't know what she said, Frank admitted. She hasn't spoken a word in 2 years. Ryland paused on the line. Frank, ask her. Ask if she knows his name. Frank's chest tightened. He turned from the phone and walked to the stairs, lowering himself until he was eye level with Aria. Her face was blank, distant, but not gone. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the jacket. She didn't blink. Sweetheart, he said softly, do you know his name? The dog? No response, just the sound of wind against the house. He leaned in a little closer, voice barely above a whisper. Did you tell him something this morning? Did you call him by a name? A flicker, a twitch of her lips. Then a breath and a word, soft, cracked, but clear enough to freeze the room. Kairo. Frank's heart stilled. He blinked. Granger dropped his thermos. The phone clicked as Ryland came back online, voice suddenly sharp. What did she say? Frank stood slowly. She said his name. What is it? Frank swallowed. Kairo. Silence. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Then Ryland's voice dropped an octave. No longer the voice of a commander, now the voice of a man remembering something personal. He was never supposed to be found. Granger crossed the room in 2 steps and picked up the thermos with shaky hands. The girl hasn't said anything in 2 years. Now she says that? How would she even know? Frank shook his head slowly. She just knew. Outside, the German shepherd Kairo sat up, ears forward, eyes locked on the window, almost like he'd been waiting for his name. That night, the wind returned, but it didn't carry emptiness the way it used to. It carried something older. A name returned to the world, a thread pulled loose from a tangle of secrets, and a girl, silent for years, who had finally broken the ice, with one word. Frank Beckett hadn't been to the town library in over a year, not since the accident. But on this gray morning, with the snow melting into muddy slush and the sky hanging like a wet canvas overhead, he found himself standing at the front desk, asking an awkward teenager with chipped nail polish how to use the archived military records portal. Hal Granger stood beside him, arms folded, jaw tense. He hadn't stopped muttering under his breath since they left the house. This is going to open something, Frank, and I don't think we're ready for what crawls out. I wasn't ready for a 10-year-old to say a name no one told her, Frank replied, his voice quiet but steely. And yet, here we are. The clerk typed a few things into the desktop and pushed a chair toward them. Try the declassified tabs. Anything recent's probably redacted, though. Good luck. She popped her earbuds back in and disappeared into a corner. Frank sat. The computer flickered. Granger loomed over him like a shadow. He typed in the name slowly. Captain Mason Vance, U.S. Army. K-9 Tactical Recon Unit. Date of death reported. June 7th. Nothing. Then he tried another keyword. R207K9. A thin stream of data trickled through. Then, a report. He clicked. The document wasn't a death certificate. It was a field incident memo, time-stamped 6 weeks before the reported accident. Mason Vance had filed a classified alert to the Inspector General. Key points jumped off the screen. Unauthorized weapons drop-offs during night patrols. Missing serials from Fort Ridge Armory logs. Suspicious movements of training personnel. Hostile behavior toward K-9 unit, noted by Vance Granger, whistled under his breath. He was blowing the whistle. Frank's hand trembled slightly on the mouse. Then they silenced him. The next document confirmed it. A death report. Training accident. Helicopter malfunction. No body recovered. Dog presumed dead. But the timeline didn't match. Vance filed the report on May 20th. His unit was placed on restricted status May 24th. His death wasn't declared until June 7th, 2 weeks later. Frank leaned back in the chair. He was alive. After they locked the report, after they tried to shut him up. Granger muttered, and maybe he tried to escape. Frank turned slowly to him. Not alone. Back at the house, Aria sat cross-legged on the rug, drawing quietly. Kairo rested nearby, eyes half closed but not asleep. Every sound made his ears twitch. Every shift of light was tracked. Frank walked in with a folder full of printed documents. He didn't show them to Aria, didn't need to. She looked at him, then looked at the dog, and somehow she knew. Kairo wasn't just a dog, Frank whispered to himself as he sat. He was a witness. Granger didn't sit. He stood near the fireplace, rubbing a finger across a burn mark on the mantel. An old scar from some other time. He must have seen what they did to Vance. Frank nodded. And he ran. But why here? Frank looked at Aria, and something inside him sank. She was still drawing, but this time the picture wasn't just her parents. It was them. Mom, Dad, her, and a dog. A very specific dog. Kairo. Drawn next to them as if he'd always been part of their world. That night, Frank made another call. Not to the sheriff, but to someone he hadn't spoken to since his own deployment ended, an old Army buddy, Mark Lerner, now working as a defense contractor in D.C. "Frank?" Lerner's voice crackled on the line. "Been years. You all right?" "Not really," Frank said. "Need intel on a dead man. Mason Vance, Fort Ridge. You ever hear the name?" Lerner went quiet. Then, "Frank, that name's not supposed to exist anymore. I think the dog made sure it does." Silence. Then a whisper, almost reverent. "You have the shepherd?" "I do." More silence. Then Lerner said one word that Frank hadn't expected. "Run." The crayons were always arranged in the same wooden box, colors worn and faded from years of small fingers pressing them down to stubs. Aria hadn't touched them in nearly a year. But this morning she had pulled them out herself. No words, no glance at Frank, just a quiet act, like drawing breath after being underwater too long. Frank watched her from the kitchen, coffee mug going cold in his hand. Outside, the snow had melted into patches of brown grass and muddy tracks, Cairo's prints visible like quiet echoes. Inside, the only sound was the soft scrape of crayon on paper. Aria sat cross-legged on the floor by the window. The late morning light brushed her shoulder like a gentle hand, highlighting the copper strands in her hair. Kairo lay beside her, not touching, not crowding, just near. His body still, his eyes watching, but not protectively, attentively, as if he was listening to something no one else could hear. She drew in long strokes first, not detailed, just shapes, Her tongue pressed lightly to the corner of her lip, a habit she'd always had when thinking. Then the shapes became things. Frank walked over slowly and crouched beside her. She didn't flinch, didn't stop. He didn't interrupt. It wasn't until she started shading in the vehicle that Frank felt his heart slow, then skip. It was black, angular, too precise to be just a child's scribble. It wasn't a car or a van. It was a truck, a military-grade one. And behind it, in the picture, jagged lines marked something that looked like cliffs. A canyon, sharp rock faces on either side. She colored the sky with wide blue strokes, but left a strip of white near the top. An aircraft? Or smoke? Frank swallowed hard. "Aria," he said gently. "Is this something you saw?" She didn't answer, just kept drawing. Her hand shifted to orange. She began to scribble in a corner. Erratic, rough. Fire? Kairo stood, moved closer, lowered his head until it touched the corner of the page. Aria's fingers stopped. Then, without lifting her gaze, she whispered, "It was loud." Frank's breath caught. She hadn't spoken again since that moment in scene 2.3. He wasn't sure she ever would. But there it was. Quiet. Uneven. A sentence like a heartbeat returning after a long arrest. "Where was this?" Frank asked softly, pointing to the canyon. "Did you see this in a dream?" She shook her head slowly. Not dream, memory. Frank sat back, heart pounding. He remembered now. The accident report had said country road, ice, no foul play. But he had driven that road before. There were no cliffs, no canyons, nothing that looked like what Aria was drawing now. Unless it wasn't where the crash happened. It was where it ended up. Frank looked down at the paper again. Something about it bothered him. The black truck, the canyon, the way it tilted like it was half off a ledge. He didn't know what disturbed him more, that Aria might have remembered something that had been erased by trauma, or that someone had changed the scene entirely. Kairo lay back down, closer now. His front paw stretched until it gently touched the edge of the paper. Aria looked at him, then leaned in and whispered again. Not to Frank, to the dog. It wasn't an accident. Frank stood and crossed the room to his desk, pulled out the folder. Inside were the files he'd printed about Mason Vance, about the helicopter crash, the supposed accident, and the sealed documents. He stared at the matching elements, dates that didn't line up, missing witness statements, names blacked out like ghosts. Then he looked at the drawing again. One detail chilled him. In the corner, just behind the truck, a figure, not fully drawn, just a shadow, but unmistakable, and right beside it, a smaller one, four-legged, standing still, watching. That night, Frank didn't sleep. He sat by the window with a notebook in hand, writing everything down. Across the room, Aria slept on the couch, Kairo curled beside her like a living shield. Her drawing still lay on the floor. A child's memory? A warning? A cry for truth? Whatever it wasn't over. And Frank knew now. The crash that killed his daughter wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. It began with a sound. Not loud, not frantic, just steady, deliberate. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. Frank looked up from the sink, coffee forgotten in his hand. Outside the kitchen window, Kairo stood near the old shed, the one Emily used as a makeshift garden workspace before everything fell apart. His paw scraped at the base of the door, then stopped, ears twitching as if waiting for permission. Frank stepped out, boots crunching on the frozen mud. Aria was already watching from inside, her drawing in her lap forgotten, her breath fogging the glass. "Kairo?" Frank called gently. "What is it, boy?" Kairo didn't move, just turned his head slightly, eyes locking with Frank's, then returned to the door. A signal. A lead. Frank hadn't seen that posture in years, not since Afghanistan. Not since the dogs led them into ruins, tunnels, caves, following scents long erased to human senses. He stepped closer. The lock on the shed had rusted through years ago, barely hung on by a wire loop. Frank pushed it open with effort. A stale, earthy scent hit him. Mold, wet cardboard, dust. The inside was a graveyard of half-used tools, broken ceramic pots, and crates that once held seed packets and bulbs. Kairo slipped in first, nose low to the floor. His tail was stiff, his paws precise. He sniffed in widening circles, then stopped at the far corner near a toppled stack of wooden boxes. Then came the whine, soft but rising in pitch. Frank knelt and began moving the crates one by one, hands cold, breath shallow. And there it was. Underneath an old tarp, wedged between the floorboards and a rusted watering can, something rectangular glinted faintly in the light. He pulled it free. It was caked in dirt. The screen cracked. The protective case was warped and swollen, likely from water damage, but he'd recognize it anywhere. Emily's phone, the one she always carried in her jacket pocket, the one that was never found in the wreckage. Frank's stomach twisted. "Kairo," he whispered, looking at the dog. "How did you—" But Kairo was still, watching. Not for praise, not for reward, only confirmation, only clarity. As if to say, I didn't forget. You shouldn't either. An hour later, Sheriff Ellis stood at the kitchen table, gloves on, examining the phone with the reverence of a bomb technician. "You're absolutely sure this belonged to Emily?" he asked. Frank nodded. She had a chipped corner on the case. She glued a little sticker of a sunflower over it, Aria's favorite. Ellis turned the device in his hand. The sunflower was still there, faded, warped, but intact. "Jesus," he muttered. This shouldn't be here." "No," Frank said, voice like gravel. "It should have been with her body. Or in the wreckage. Not buried in a garden shed half a mile away." Ellis didn't answer immediately. He stepped to the window and stared at the shed, then at the child behind the glass. Aria was drawing again, this time shapes that looked like paw prints and shadows. "Kairo led you there?" he asked finally. Frank nodded. "Just this morning. He hasn't been near that shed in the week since he showed up." Ellis took a slow breath. "We'll run a full forensic analysis. Water damage might have killed the circuits, but the memory chip, that might still have GPS logs, messages, photos, maybe even voice memos." Frank stepped forward. "Sheriff, do you believe now that the crash wasn't clean?" Ellis looked at him, something unreadable flickering across his face. Not doubt, but something older. Regret. "Frank," he said quietly, "I didn't believe it then, but I should have." That night, Frank found himself sitting outside on the porch. The cold bit at his fingers, but he didn't move. Kairo lay beside him, silent and still. Across the yard, the shed loomed like a dark silhouette against the night sky. What else was hidden there? What else had been erased? He looked down at Kairo. You remembered where she dropped it, didn't you? He whispered. All this time, and you brought it back. Kairo didn't move, only blinked once, slow and deliberate. Frank leaned back and stared at the stars. They covered it up. Someone wiped the scene, maybe even moved the truck, but they didn't count on you. And in that silence, with the wind brushing through the trees and the air thick with coming snow, Frank felt the shift. This wasn't just a grieving family anymore. This was a trail, and Kairo had just taken the first step. The trail wasn't marked. It wasn't on any map, not even the detailed forestry charts Frank kept from his days volunteering with search and rescue. But Kairo walked it like he'd known it forever. His body low, breath even, each step measured. Not sniffing randomly like a dog chasing rabbits. This was a pattern, a memory, stitched into muscle and nerve. Frank followed behind, boots crunching over half-frozen ground, the shotgun slung across his back, more habit than necessity. Sheriff Ellis was with them too, quieter than usual, radio clipped to his vest but turned low. And between them, bundled in a heavy jacket 2 sizes too big, was Aria. She hadn't spoken again since that morning in the shed. She didn't need to. Her eyes never left Kairo, and Kairo never looked back. He just led. Through firs bowed low under the weight of old snow, past fallen logs and frost-bitten underbrush. The sky was the color of lead, and the sun had never truly risen. They walked in silence for almost an hour before Kairo stopped. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't bark. He just froze ears forward, eyes locked on something just beyond a cluster of pine trees matted with ice. Frank came up beside him. Then he saw it. At first it looked like a mound of snow, just another collapsed drift beneath the tree line. But then the light shifted. A strip of chrome, a curve of shattered glass, a rusted bumper. Frank's breath caught. It wasn't the car Emily and Jacob had driven. It was a truck, black, military grade, angled halfway off a rock shelf hidden under snow, branches, and thyme. Ellis exhaled slowly. That's not supposed to be here. Frank moved closer, boots slipping slightly on the frozen incline. The truck had no plates. The front end was crumpled inward, as if something or someone had slammed into it at high speed. The passenger side door was twisted open, hinges torn. No bodies, no blood. But the seat belts were cut. Inside, dusted in snow and ice, something glinted faintly. Frank reached in and pulled it out. A nameplate. Vance. M. K9 Unit. R207. He handed it silently to Ellis. The sheriff took it like he was holding a grenade. This is Mason Vance's truck, he muttered. Aria stepped forward slowly. Her boots made small crunches in the frost. She stared into the cabin. Then she pointed at the dashboard. Frank looked. There, taped beneath the cracked console, was a photograph. 3 figures, a soldier in uniform, a woman holding a toddler, and a German shepherd sitting tall between them. Frank's throat tightened. Aria didn't blink. "That's her," she whispered. "That's the woman who cried." Ellis turned sharply. "What?" Aria didn't repeat it. She just kept staring. They searched the surrounding area for over an hour. No other vehicles, no fresh prints. But they did find a trail of metal casings buried beneath the snow, 5 of them, standard issue 9mm, half rusted. And one more thing. A footprint. Boot tread, recent. Not more than a few days old. Frank knelt beside it, frowning. Someone came back. Ellis nodded grimly. Or never left. Kairo was still staring into the trees, tail stiff, body alert. But he didn't move. He wasn't tracking anymore. He was guarding. Back at the truck, Frank swept the interior with his flashlight again, finding remnants of gear-nothing with ID, just scraps. But in the back seat, beneath a torn blanket, he pulled out something that made him go still. A dog harness. Faded. Torn. But stitched into the side, almost worn away by time and weather, were letters. R207 Kairo. Frank looked at the dog. Kairo stood silently in the snow, nose tilted into the wind, as if smelling something far off, something not of this place, not of this moment. Then, slowly, he turned and walked toward Aria. She held out her hand. He pressed his head against her fingers. A quiet pact, a wordless vow. As they hiked back, Ellis radioed for a forensics team and a snow-rated tow unit. Frank didn't speak much. Aria didn't either. But something had shifted. This wasn't a search anymore. It was a reckoning. And Kairo had just unearthed the first buried truth. One wreck, one witness. And the question that now clawed its way into every breath. If this truck had been here all along, what really happened to Emily and Jacob? The forest didn't speak, not in words, but in the wind brushing through brittle pine needles, in the hush of snow falling from limbs heavy with secrets. It whispered. Frank knelt in the clearing where Kairo had led them earlier, digging with his gloved hands at the half-thawed earth just beneath a patch of brown snow. The scent of motor oil lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. He brushed aside more debris, wet leaves, brittle pine cones, and finally a sliver of hard metal that caught the light. It wasn't rusted like the truck from earlier. It was newer, chrome. He pried it loose. A fragment of bumper, jagged at the edge, still bearing flecks of navy blue paint. Frank's brow furrowed. Emily and Jacob had driven a white crossover. This wasn't from their car. Kairo stood nearby, tense but still. His ears twitched at every shift of wind, his eyes locked on something beyond human reach, as though the forest itself was giving testimony only he could understand. Frank kept going. A few feet away, half buried in a tangled mat of roots, something else glinted. The shattered glass from a side mirror. He pulled it free. The reflective surface was cracked, but intact enough to catch his own distorted face. It wasn't from Emily's vehicle either. And that was when the sick realization hit him. This wasn't just one crash site. It was a graveyard, a dumping ground. Aria had wandered a little farther uphill, her boots crunching over old snow. She didn't speak, didn't call, but Frank kept her in his periphery, always watching. She was walking in line with Kairo, who now moved with increasing purpose. His nose hovered just above the frozen surface, then stopped. His body went still. Aria's small hand reached out, no hesitation, no fear, and gently lifted a flap of fabric from a low thorn bush. The world narrowed. Frank rose and walked over quickly, breath fogging in the cold air. In her hand was a strip of cloth, torn, frayed, mud-streaked, but unmistakable. Soft, floral pattern, pale blue with small yellow blossoms. It had once been part of a scarf, the scarf Emily had worn the day she died. Frank had helped her pick it out that spring. It had still smelled like lavender. He reached out, gently taking it from Aria's fingers. His hands trembled. "You're sure?" he asked softly. Aria nodded. eyes glassy. "She wore it when we left the house," she whispered. "Not they. We." It was the first time she'd spoken of that day as if she had been there, not just watching it in dreams. Sheriff Ellis arrived 10 minutes later, having doubled back from checking the trail for tire tracks. When Frank showed him the bumper fragment and scarf, the sheriff didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he exhaled sharply and said, "There's more here than just Mason's crash. You said you didn't recognize this bumper." Frank shook his head. "Too new, too different. But it looks like it collided. Hard." Ellis turned toward the ridgeline, his gaze tracing the shape of the land. "This place wasn't meant to be found." Frank looked down at the scarf in his hand. It had dried stiff in the cold. Fragile now, like memory. "Then why did she remember?" he asked, glancing at Aria. The little girl stood next to Kairo, who was now sitting protectively in front of her. His head barely came up to her shoulder, but his presence dwarfed everything around them. "She didn't just survive," Frank murmured, realization blooming like ice. "She saw something." Ellis radioed in for a ground unit. Drones, sonar, maybe even excavation support. But Frank already knew what they'd find. There'd been another vehicle, maybe more. This patch of forest, this forgotten piece of the map, was a silent witness. And now, thanks to one dog and one broken child who never forgot, the silence was unraveling. Back at the cabin that night, Frank placed the torn scarf in a sealed evidence bag and set it gently beside the phone they had found in the shed. Pieces, fragments. None of them screamed, none of them bled, but each whispered something undeniable. It wasn't an accident. Something, or someone, had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase what happened, and now the past was clawing its way back through the snow. Kairo lay curled near the fire, eyes half closed, but his ears twitched at every distant sound. Aria sat beside him, her small hand resting on his fur. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Frank watched the two of them, this unlikely pair of survivors, and felt something stir that had been dead in him since the funeral. Purpose, not revenge, not rage, but the kind of quiet fury that only a grandfather, a soldier, a father could know. Tomorrow they would go deeper, not just into the woods, but into the truth. The kitchen table had become an impromptu war room. Paper towels stained with melted snow. A map of the northern ridge spread open, marked in red ink and thumbtacks. And now, resting gently in a Ziploc bag that crinkled every time it moved, the purse. Emily's purse. Recovered from beneath the frost-bitten rubble near the twisted remains of a bumper no one could explain. Sheriff Ellis had brought it in earlier that morning, after the forensic team cleared the perimeter and carefully dug it out from beneath an old cedar stump. It had been lodged deep, protected somewhat from the elements. Frank had waited until Aria went upstairs before opening it. Inside were things expected: a lip balm tube, a keychain shaped like a daisy, a folded receipt for 2 chocolate croissants, and a peppermint tea dated the morning she died. And one thing that wasn't expected: a photograph, small, faded at the corners. The kind of picture meant to be kept close, not shared. Emily stood smiling on one side, wind in her hair, her hand resting lightly on the chest of a man in military uniform. The man was not Frank, and he was not Mason Vance. This man was younger than Frank remembered Mason being. Clean-cut, fit, eyes sharp, calculating, the kind of man who knew how to carry a weapon without looking armed. Taped to the back of the photo was a name: Colton Price. Frank sat very still. The name meant nothing to him, but it meant something. Emily never mentioned anyone named Colton, never once in all their conversations, even when she'd called crying after Jacob missed Lily's birthday. She would have said something, wouldn't she? Unless she couldn't. Aria came down the stairs without a word, Kairo at her heel like a shadow stitched to her breath. Frank quickly slid the photo back into the evidence bag and sealed it with trembling hands. But it was too late. Her eyes had already locked on it. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She simply reached for the bag. Frank hesitated, then handed it over. Her fingers touched the plastic, tentative at first, then with strange resolve. She turned the photo over in her hand, looking at the two figures. Her eyes lingered on the man. Her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Then she whispered a word so soft it barely carried across the table. "Colton." Frank's stomach twisted. "You know him?" Aria nodded slowly. Her voice came out like fog on glass. "He drove the black truck." Frank went cold. "You saw him?" Her fingers tightened around the edge of the photo. Aria didn't look up. Her voice was so quiet it sounded like a memory being born. "He yelled at Mama." Frank stared at her. Cairo's ears flicked. "What did he say, sweetheart?" Frank asked gently, trying not to push, not to scare. But Aria only whispered, "He said she should have stayed quiet." Sheriff Ellis was called immediately. Frank read him the name, showed him the photograph, the time stamp on the back. Fort Claremont, April 14th. A base decommissioned 3 years ago after a classified incident no one in town ever talked about. Ellis stiffened when he heard it. "Colton Price," he said slowly. "That name's familiar." Frank didn't blink. "Familiar how?" Ellis ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking 10 years older. "There were rumors about a contractor, off books, who trained K-9s for black ops units. No badge, no record. But people whispered he was part of something big, a project tied to Fort Claremont before it was shut down." Frank looked down at the photo again. Emily's smile wasn't forced. But it wasn't happy either. It was the kind of smile you give when someone's taking a picture you didn't agree to, but you had to go along with. Later that night, Frank found Aria sitting by the hearth, staring at the flames as they flickered across the room. She still held the photo. Kairo lay beside her, his muzzle resting gently on her knee. Frank sat down without a word. She didn't look at him. But after a long pause, she said softly, "Mama was scared of him." Frank nodded, his voice dry. "I think we all should be." The meeting took place in a nursing home that smelled of bleach and forgotten birthdays. Room 112, end of the hall. No family photos on the dresser, just a U.S. flag folded into a perfect triangle inside a dusty frame. The man in the bed was smaller than Frank remembered. Bones had pulled taut beneath wrinkled skin, and the once sharp eyes of Colonel Leon Graves were dulled, cataract-glazed, but still watching. Frank closed the door behind him, stepping into the quiet like a man walking into a church. "I never thought I'd see you again, Beckett," Graves rasped. "Not since Kandahar." Frank nodded, pulled a chair close. "Didn't come for nostalgia." "Didn't think you did." The colonel coughed, dry and hoarse. "You came for ghosts." He was right. Frank took out the photograph, the one of Emily and Colton Price, and slid it across the tray table. Graves stared at it, unmoving. After a long moment, he said, "He shouldn't be alive." Frank's pulse quickened. "But he is." Graves didn't deny it. The story came out in fragments, as if each piece carried too much weight to be spoken in one breath. Back when Fort Ridge was still operational, before the Pentagon scrubbed it off every map, A private contractor named Spectratech Defense had been brought in under a black budget initiative. Officially, they were meant to streamline K-9 deployment for high-risk urban warfare. Unofficially, they were doing something else. They weren't training dogs, Graves muttered. They were modifying them. Frank's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Neurobehavioral enhancement, chemical conditioning, memory implantation, turning them into assets, not partners. Replacing instinct with response. No emotion, just obedience, and they didn't stop at the dogs. Frank felt a chill trace the back of his neck. Graves went on. Mason Vance, an elite handler with actual battlefield experience, was brought in to oversee a batch of dogs labeled Red Tier. Max had been one of them. Loyal, brilliant, unbreakable, until they tried to overwrite him. Vance pushed back, falsified some reports, delayed others, long enough to contact a former behavioral analyst, Emily Beckett. She had clearance, Graves said, more than she should have. She was quiet, smart, someone they didn't notice at first. Frank swallowed hard. So they worked together? They tried, Graves replied. Started collecting evidence, test results, footage. Emily was supposed to testify anonymously at a Senate hearing. But then, Mason's truck flipped on a closed training route. One of the dogs went missing. Frank's throat tightened. Kairo. Graves nodded. His chip had been deactivated, on purpose. Same with the body cam feed. Someone wiped the entire system. And Emily? Frank asked, voice cracking. She disappeared a week later. Car accident. Right before she was scheduled to leave for D.C. The silence between them swelled like a wound reopening. Graves pulled a file from beneath his mattress, old, battered, its corners frayed like the edges of a battlefield map. Inside were faded memos, blurry images of vials and cages, surveillance stills of men in black gear, and one file labeled Spectratech Personnel. See Price. Frank flipped it open. Colton Price. Same eyes, same smirk, but colder. He hadn't aged a day in a decade. He was more than a trainer, Graves whispered. He was their fail-safe, a handler of handlers. If a soldier went rogue, Price made sure they didn't stay that way long. Frank clenched his jaw. He silenced them. Call it what you want. Frank stood to leave. The pieces were coming together, but the picture was darker than he'd feared. Mason's death hadn't been a loss. It had been a warning. Emily's accident wasn't coincidence. And Kairo hadn't just survived. He had escaped and returned for Aria, for justice, maybe even for redemption. At the door, Graves said one last thing, voice raw but clear. They thought they broke Max. Frank turned back. But in the end, the colonel said, almost smiling, that dog chose love over programming. He led Aria back here for a reason. Frank's voice was low. And what reason is that? Graves stared at the ceiling. To finish his handler's mission. Back at the cabin, Frank placed the Spectratech file on the table like a loaded weapon. Aria sat quietly across from him, Kairo curled at her feet. The fire crackled, throwing shadows like ghosts against the walls. He handed her the photo of her mother one last time, now knowing the danger it had cost. Aria looked at it. Then, slowly, she whispered, "We have to stop him." Frank didn't ask who him was, because he already knew. The pencil scratched gently across the paper. Aria sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her eyes narrowed in concentration as she sketched. Kairo lay beside her, tail thumping once with every completed line, as if keeping rhythm. Frank watched from the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee. The wood stove crackled behind him, but the image unfolding on the page chilled him far more than the winter outside. A giant glass tank, ripples of blue. Fish, dozens of them, looping endlessly in a spiral. In the corner, a small bench. And underneath it, something dark. Frank rose. He walked slowly to her and crouched, careful not to break her focus. "That looks familiar?" Aria didn't look up, but the pencil paused. "Where is this, sweetheart?" Her hand tapped the top left corner of the page. In small, careful lettering, she had written, "Tucson Reef." Frank blinked. "The aquarium?" She nodded. He hadn't thought about that place in years. Emily used to take Aria every third Sunday. It was their ritual. A quiet space filled with movement, soothing, mysterious, predictable in the way a grieving mind could rely on. "What's this under the bench?" Aria didn't answer. But Kairo lifted his head, as if he remembered too. That afternoon Frank bundled Aria in her thickest coat and scarf. She didn't resist. She didn't speak either. The roads into Tucson were half frozen, sun glaring off the ice, and Frank drove in silence with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near his service pistol. His gut hadn't stopped twisting since Graves's confession. The map, the name, the pattern. Everything pointed to Emily knowing she didn't have much time. She must have hidden something. The Tucson Reef exhibit hadn't changed much, still quiet, still oddly humid inside, still playing that soft instrumental music that reminded Frank of yoga studios and dentists' offices. They moved through the coral tunnels and jellyfish tanks, passing small children pressing their noses to glass and parents snapping photos they'd forget by next week. But Aria walked with purpose, Kairo at her side, like she was following a scent Frank couldn't smell. They stopped at a secluded seating area near the Pacific Predator tank. A bench was tucked in the corner, the same shape, same wood grain, just as Aria had drawn it. She crouched. Kairo stood guard. Frank scanned the area. No cameras directly overhead. No staff nearby. Just the hum of water filters and the dull echo of children's voices bouncing off acrylic walls. Then, a small gasp. Aria reached beneath the bench and pulled out a plastic container sealed tight with duct tape. It was grimy. A faint smear of dried algae clung to the edge. Frank took it gently, peeled the tape back. Inside was a black USB drive. No label, until you tilted it in the light. Then the faint laser etching appeared. For DOJ only. Frank exhaled, slow and hollow. This wasn't just a clue. It was insurance. Back at the truck, Frank used his encrypted laptop, a leftover from a short consultancy gig he did for the county's emergency management team. He inserted the drive with gloved fingers, the kind of caution born from too many stories that ended in fire and silence. A folder popped up, password protected. He looked at Aria in the rearview mirror. "Any idea what it could be?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Kairo." He typed it in. The screen blinked once, then opened. Dozens of video files, each time-stamped, each tagged with Spectratech project IDs, names of test subjects, handler footage, and one file titled Phase 4, Termination Protocol, Override Failure, Max 01. Frank clicked it. The video was grainy but clear enough. Mason Vance knelt beside Max, younger, stronger, but already scarred. Behind them, men in black tactical gear shouted orders. A handler yelled for the override. Max didn't respond. Instead, he lunged, Not at Mason, but toward one of the Spectratech guards, intercepting a shot meant for Vance. Then chaos, screams, gunfire. And finally, Mason's voice, hoarse and defiant. "This ends now. I'm taking it to DOJ. Emily's waiting." Frank closed the laptop. The truck cabin was still. Aria's fingers were wrapped around Kairo's collar. She didn't cry, but something in her had shifted. She had remembered. And now, so had the world. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, gentle, quiet, like ash after a fire long burned out. But Frank knew better. This storm was just beginning. The wind howled against the cabin walls like it was trying to get in. Inside, the fire had burned low, just embers now. Frank sat hunched over his laptop, the screen casting a cold blue glow across his lined face. His hands hovered, hesitated, not from fear, but from reverence, from the sense that what lay inside this next folder wasn't just data, it was memory. And memories, when exhumed, never stay silent. Kairo lay at Aria's feet by the hearth, head resting on his paws, ears twitching every time the wood creaked. Aria held his collar like a child holds the edge of a raft in open sea. Frank clicked open the folder labeled Echo Logs, EB-MV, Confidential. There were 18 files, emails, scanned photographs, GPS logs, and 3 audio recordings. He opened the first one. Emily's voice filtered through the speakers, hesitant, rushed, like she was recording it in a moment stolen between 2 decisions. March 9th. Mason says we don't have much time. Spectratech's pushing Phase 4 despite behavioral collapse in all red-tier dogs except Max. They're calling it efficiency. I call it erasure. If anyone ever hears this, tell Aria I was trying to protect something good in this world, something that couldn't speak for itself. Frank swallowed hard. His hand reached for the coffee beside him and stopped midway. The next file. March 12th. We caught Price watching us. He knows. Mason said to upload everything to the DOJ channel, but the portal failed again. I hit a backup at Tucson Reef. I don't trust anyone, not even Graves, not anymore. If anything happens to me. A pause. Then her voice cracked. If anything happens to me, follow Kairo. The words hung in the room like incense. Heavy, holy. Frank leaned back. The fire popped, sending a tiny cascade of sparks upward. Aria's head turned slowly. She had heard it too. All of it. He opened the image folder. One photo showed a clipboard with a list of dog units, their handlers, and their behavioral outcomes. Max, deceased. Blitz, euthanized. Shadow, transferred. Kairo, missing. Beside Kairo's name, someone had scrawled in red pen, "Override failed, destroy on sight." Frank's stomach twisted. These weren't just dogs, they were targets. The last file was an email from Emily to someone named R. Hartman at bioarms.def. Subject line, "They're coming for us." She wrote, "We didn't sign up for this. You said they'd stop after the first phase, but they're accelerating. Max is the only one left with enough control, but Price knows we're stalling. Mason thinks he can buy time. I think we're already out of it. If I disappear, check Kairo's tracker. If he's still moving, there's still hope." Frank looked up slowly. "Kairo," he whispered. The dog raised his head. For a second, just a second, there was something in Kairo's eyes that didn't belong to a dog, something remembered. Aria stood now. She walked toward the laptop and, without a word, pointed to the third audio file. one Frank hadn't opened yet. He clicked. The voice that came next was Mason Vance's. "This is Handler Vance. If you're hearing this, I'm likely dead or worse. Cairo's not just a unit. He remembers everything. We embedded memory markers, visual triggers. He can't speak, but he can guide. He knows who Price is. He knows what Spectratech did. Follow the trails, the patterns. He will take you to the truth. And if they try to stop you, run." Frank shut the laptop. His hands trembled, but not from age. The war wasn't over. It had just moved, from battlefields to memory cards, from scars to whispers, and the dog sleeping quietly beside the fireplace. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness. That night, Frank placed the USB drive into a small lockbox. He wrapped it in a cloth and slid it under a loose floorboard behind the wood stove, an old habit from his time in covert medevac. He didn't trust the cloud, didn't trust the feds, didn't trust the sheriff either, but he trusted the girl. And the dog. He looked at Aria. She was staring at the fire again, arms around Kairo, her chin resting on his back. For a moment, Frank imagined what it was like to be her, losing a world, then being handed the burden of its truth without warning, without language. And yet, she'd carried it through silence, through trauma, through drawings and dreams, and that single whispered name that changed everything. Kairo. Outside, a gust of wind slammed against the glass. But this time, none of them flinched. Because now they knew. Kairo hadn't just come home. He had come back with a mission. And a war still left to finish. It was just after dawn when Frank noticed the silence was too quiet. The fire had burned out. The kettle hadn't been touched. The blanket on the sofa, where Aria had fallen asleep the night before with Kairo curled beside her, was folded with near-perfect care. And the front door? Open. Barely. Just an inch. But in a house where everything was ritual and shadow, that inch felt like a scream. "Aria?" No answer. His voice cracked louder the second time. "Aria!" Frank moved fast, barefoot, heart pounding in that awful rhythm known only to men who have lost and refused to lose again. He swung the door wide. Snow blanketed the porch, fresh from the night. Two sets of tracks carved through the whiteness, one small and booted, the other paw-shaped, steady, sure. They disappeared into the trees beyond the shed. Frank's breath fogged in the air. A folded piece of paper fluttered against the rocking chair, pinned by a smooth stone. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Aria's handwriting, careful, deliberate, childlike, but resolute, filled the center of the page. "Don't worry. We'll find who hurt Mom." The words didn't just break the morning. They shattered the past 2 years. Frank stood frozen in the doorway, the letter crinkling softly in his fist. Kairo had taken her. No, she had followed Kairo. The difference mattered. Aria wasn't running from something anymore. She was running toward it. He was in motion before he finished dressing. His hands worked with muscle memory. Field pack, first aid, sidearm, emergency radio, spare leash, 2 flares, granola bars. It wasn't his first time tracking someone through snow, but it was the first time the someone was his granddaughter. As he stepped off the porch, he paused. At the base of the trail, something caught his eye. A single glove, Aria's, resting on a flat rock, placed there, not dropped. a marker, just like Mason used to leave for extraction teams. Frank felt something rise in his throat. Pride, fear, guilt, all tangled. The trail through the woods was narrow, the snow undisturbed except for the small human prints and the clean, wide spacing of a shepherd's gate. She hadn't hesitated, not once. Branches clawed at Frank's sleeves as he pushed forward, the forest narrowing around him like a whispering crowd. The early sun filtered through the trees in long ribbons, but the chill never lifted. He moved fast but careful, ears tuned to sound, eyes to any change in the trail. Then, ahead, in the snow, another sign. A small stuffed bear, worn, torn at one ear, set upright on a tree stump, facing west. A signal. Aria was using everything she had learned in silence. Frank checked his radio. Still no signal. The mountains blocked everything. He was alone out here. But Kairo wasn't. And that gave him a flicker of hope. Because if Kairo had chosen to lead her, it meant he'd protect her, the way he'd once protected Mason, the way he refused to let Emily's truth stay buried. Still, every snapped twig felt like a gunshot, every shadow a threat. Another 30 minutes of hiking and the trail veered sharply downhill, toward the old Forest Service road that hadn't been used since the mudslide last winter. Half the signs were gone, but there, etched into the soft crust of snow, was something unmistakable, a paw print, pressed deeper than the others. Frank crouched. It was different from Kairo's, bigger. Another dog? Or a wolf? No. Closer inspection revealed the faint edge of a claw filed smooth. Military training. Frank's eyes narrowed. They weren't alone out here. The trees thinned suddenly, opening to a ridge that overlooked a dried-up creek bed, and down below, framed against the snow, movement. Two figures, one small, one four-legged. Aria and Kairo, standing before something half-buried in the embankment. Frank's heart surged. He descended the slope as quickly as he dared, boots slipping on ice-crusted patches. When he got within shouting distance, he stopped. He didn't want to startle her. "Aria!" he called gently. She turned, face red from wind, eyes wide, but not afraid. "Kairo brought me here," she said. Her voice, a whisper, but clear. Then she pointed. Frank followed her gaze. Buried beneath broken pine and snow jutting from the bank like a metal splinter, a truck bumper, black, dented, dried blood on the edge, and near it a fragment of license plate. Frank's breath caught. This wasn't the car crash site they'd been told about. It was the truth, and his 10-year-old granddaughter had found it, with a dog no one believed had survived, with a voice no one thought would return. He knelt beside her, eyes locked on the twisted steel, the blood-stained snow, the weight of 2 years collapsing into a single, irrefutable moment. She handed him something small, another photo, this one scorched at the corner. The edges curled. It showed Emily and the man named Price, and behind them, the same truck. Frank clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a trail anymore. It was a declaration. The war was no longer in the shadows. And it had just been brought into the light by a little girl and her silent guardian. The canyon stretched wide beneath a bruised sky where winter's breath moved like a ghost through the pine-topped ridges. Gusts danced across the ledges in eerie rhythm, scattering snow in fine sheets over the landscape, like memories too light to hold. And in the middle of that silence, Aria walked. Her boots crunched with purpose, her breath fogging the air in soft, rhythmless bursts. Kairo padded steadily beside her, every step careful, every sense alert. He had taken the lead when the wind grew harsher, when the markers on the old forest road disappeared. Now he walked just behind her, letting her lead. This part of the trail had been abandoned for years. An old ranger station was said to be somewhere past the second ridge, swallowed up by time and trees. Aria remembered it, not clearly, but as a place her mother had once spoken about. A place with green-painted shutters and a rusty old radio tower out back. A place they could hide or rest or find something left behind. And Kairo seemed to remember too, as if he'd been there before. High above, a black shape buzzed softly across the sky, unseen by Aria, but not by Kairo. He stopped, growled low, a drone, far out enough not to startle the girl, but close enough to track. Sheriff Ellis had deployed it once. Frank reported the tracks heading into the gorge. The town's resources were limited, but Ellis had pulled every favor he had left. One missing girl was enough to wake even the laziest part of the local system. But the fact that she had been led by a military-trained dog, that was something else. The drone caught heat signatures, 2 of them, small and steady, about half a mile north of where Frank last spotted them. Ellis exhaled. "They're alive," he said into the radio, "and they're moving." Back on the trail, Aria paused near a dead tree, splintered by lightning. Something glinted near its roots, half buried in dirt and frozen leaves. She knelt, brushed aside the slush. A strap. Kairo's nose twitched, then lowered. It was a backpack, moldy, torn at the side, but zippered tight. She pulled it free slowly, her gloves slick with melting frost. The fabric made a soft crackle when opened, the sound of things forgotten. Inside, a small thermos, a penlight, a keychain shaped like a wolf, and a bracelet, her mother's, woven red thread with a tiny glass charm shaped like a bell, the one she always wore on long drives. Aria's fingers trembled as she lifted it. Kairo sat down beside her, his eyes never leaving hers. There was more. A folded piece of paper. No, a photo. The edges were water-stained, but the image was still clear. Colton Price, in military gear, standing near a Humvee. But it was the background that made Aria's breath catch. A sign, Fort Ridge, East Gate. And next to it, the silhouette of Emily, not smiling, just standing, like she'd been caught mid-warning. The wind howled louder, snapping branches nearby. Kairo stood. Aria tucked the bracelet into her coat pocket. She hesitated with the photo, then slid it between 2 pages of her notebook. In the distance, through a line of bare trees, the ranger station appeared, leaning, rusted, but still there. She moved toward it, legs heavy with cold. Kairo followed, his breath visible, his steps faster now, ears forward. Frank and the sheriff reached the perimeter 10 minutes later. The drone hovered down to guide them, its signal blinking faster. The ranger station came into view, and 2 silhouettes just inside the frame of the crooked porch. "Aria, Kairo." Frank called out, louder this time, and she looked up. No fear, no guilt, just a quiet nod. As if she'd known they would come eventually, but she had needed to be first, to find it, to prove it. Frank reached her in seconds, crouched, hands gripping her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked, voice breaking. She didn't speak. She just took out the bracelet, held it out. Frank's breath hitched. And when she opened the notebook to show the photo, Ellis swore softly under his breath. "Price." There he was, in uniform, in their county, at a base that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And beside him, Emily Beckett, alive, alert, months before the crash. Inside the ranger station, the dust smelled like time, but there was something comforting in the way Aria sat by the window, holding her mother's bracelet to her chest. The storm outside howled against the thin walls, but she didn't flinch. Kairo lay beside her, his flank warm against her leg. Frank watched them from the doorway, arms crossed. Something had shifted in her. Not just the courage to follow clues or brave the cold, but a kind of quiet certainty, a determination beyond her age. She wasn't just remembering, she was reclaiming. Outside, the drone lifted back into the sky. The search was over. But the real hunt, for truth, for justice, for what really happened that night, had just begun. And at the heart of it all, a girl who had finally found her voice again, and a dog who had never stopped listening. The ranger station creaked under the weight of wind and time. Inside, Frank helped Aria zip her coat, his hands trembling slightly. The bracelet she'd found still dangled from her wrist, the glass bell catching slivers of weak sunlight filtering through the broken window. Kairo stood at the threshold, muscles taut, ears swiveling like radar dishes. Something was wrong. The wind had changed, too sudden, too still. Ellis stepped outside first, his boots crunching on the crusted snow. He scanned the tree line instinctively, one hand on the grip of his service pistol. "Clear," he muttered. But Kairo didn't move. His body froze, tail stiff, eyes fixed toward the ridge. Then it happened. A crack in the air, sharp, mechanical. The echo chased itself through the canyon. Gunfire. Frank tackled Aria back into the station just as the bullet slammed into the doorframe, splintering wood inches from her shoulder. Ellis dropped low behind the porch beam, returning 2 shots into the hills with swift precision. "Sniper!" he yelled. "West Ridge!" Kairo lunged forward, barking, then suddenly pivoted mid-stride and threw his body over Aria as the second shot rang out. Blood sprayed the floorboards. Frank screamed, "Kairo!" The German shepherd grunted, body twitching. The bullet had grazed his left side, deep enough to draw blood, not deep enough to stop him. He didn't whimper, didn't collapse. He stood his ground, shielding Aria like a shield forged from flesh and loyalty. Ellis rolled across the porch and fired twice more into the tree line. But the sniper was smart. No second target, no movement. Just one message. "We know you're digging." Inside the station, Frank pulled Aria behind a rusted filing cabinet, his breath shallow. His military instincts, dulled by years, by grief, surged back like a wave. The echo of war never fully left, and now it screamed through the bones of this place. "Are you hit?" he asked, checking Aria. She shook her head, wide-eyed but silent. Her hand pressed to Kairo's fur. It was warm, too warm. He was still standing, but barely. Ellis crouched low by the shattered doorframe. "This was no accident," he said, voice tight. "They knew we were coming." "Someone's watching comms." "Or drones," Frank muttered. "We were led here, then ambushed." "No," Ellis growled. "She found this place. They're cleaning up their trail." Outside, the snow began to fall again. Softly, deceptively, covering blood, like it hadn't been spilled at all. Kairo moved suddenly. His body was shaking, but his nose flared. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Aria looked up. "He's still out there," she whispered. It was only the second time she'd spoken in years, and the words came with a quiet certainty that made Frank stop breathing. Kairo walked slowly to the window. His blood left a trail behind him, crimson dots in a field of white. Then he barked once, short, sharp, directional. Frank followed his gaze. A flash of movement between two pine trunks, too fast to be an animal. Frank raised the rifle. Ellis had passed him. "Cover me." Ellis nodded. Frank kicked open the side door and rolled into the snow. The air bit his skin like acid, but his arm stayed steady. He followed the tracks leading from the ridge, boots too clean for a hunter, too wide for a hiker. Professional. Ellis moved along the opposite flank. Then came the third shot. It hit the roof. Deliberate misfire. A signal. Frank crouched near a fallen log. From this angle he saw the shimmer of a scope behind a distant bush. But something else caught his eye. A second figure, retreating. There were two of them. The first was cover. The second, likely the handler. The one watching. Frank took a breath, aimed, pulled the trigger. The bark of his rifle echoed loud and final. The second figure dropped. Back at the cabin, Kairo collapsed. Aria knelt beside him, pressing her hands to his side. Her little frame shook, but her eyes never left his. He looked up at her, whined once. His tail thumped, slow, but there. She leaned forward and whispered something again, inaudible to Frank. But Kairo's ears lifted, and his breathing steadied. Ellis returned minutes later, dragging a backpack. Inside, 2 phones, a scoped rifle, and an encrypted radio. No ID, no insignia, no fingerprints. But a silver patch sewn into the lining said everything they needed. Spectratech Logistics. Clearance, Echo 9. Frank stared at it, jaw clenched. "They're real," Ellis said, "and they're scared." He looked down at Kairo, then back at Frank. "Means we're close." Frank nodded once, then looked at Aria. She was stroking Kairo's neck gently, whispering over and over, "You came back. You came back." And in that moment Frank realized this wasn't just a trap. It was a warning. And now it was a war. They tied him to the old radiator in the ranger station half-conscious, blood seeping from the wound in his thigh where Ellis's bullet had found flesh. He was older than Frank expected, maybe late 40s, maybe 50s. A man who had seen too many wars and picked the wrong side in all of them. The mercenary coughed, spitting a wad of blood into the corner. Snow blew through a shattered window, dancing in the cold air around them. Ellis paced behind him, gun holstered but eyes alert. Frank crouched close enough to feel the heat of the man's breath. "You were aiming at a child," Frank said, low, controlled. "That makes you a coward. And expendable." The man laughed, a dry, cracking sound like boots on brittle ice. "You think I picked the target? Orders come down from shadows, old man. I just squeezed the trigger." Ellis kicked the back of the chair. "Who gave the order?" The mercenary smirked, then winced as the pain caught up. "You really want to know who signed the kill list?" He looked between them. Colton Price. Frank froze. Ellis did too. "He's alive?" Frank asked, voice trembling not with fear, but something colder. Recognition. "More than alive," the mercenary rasped. "He's thriving. Fort Ridge, weapons testing, black market tech, dirty contracts. You name it, he runs it." Ellis leaned in. "You worked for Spectratech?" "Worked," the man coughed. "Until I botched a job. They don't forgive failure. Unless you know things." He nodded toward the backpack Ellis had confiscated. That radio? It links to a Spectratech drone server. You get someone smart enough to decrypt it, you'll see the orders. Surveillance, targets, names. Frank's fists clenched. Emily? The man nodded. She got close. Too close. Your daughter and Mason Vance? They were building a case whistleblower style. DOJ, Homeland, even the press. But Price cut the pipeline before they could blow the lid off. Ellis hissed. He staged the crash. They sent a decoy truck, jammed GPS, pushed the Beckett car off the ridge, then cleaned the scene. Made it look like bad luck. And Mason? Frank asked. The mercenary looked up. Execution. 1 round to the back of the head. His own team did it. Training accident, they called it. Frank stood too quickly. The station spun slightly around him. He gripped the wall for balance, heart hammering against memories he couldn't silence. Aria watched from the corner, eyes dark and unreadable. She sat beside Kairo, her fingers resting on his bandaged flank. The dog hadn't moved much since the ambush, but he kept his eyes open, watching, waiting. She whispered, "He knew." Frank turned. "What did you say, sweetie?" She looked at him, slow and steady. "Kairo. He was there, the night they died. He remembers." Ellis exchanged a glance with Frank. Could she be recalling trauma memory? Frank shook his head. No, she's recalling his. They both turned to Kairo. His ears perked slightly at the sound of his name, but he didn't move. Aria's hand didn't leave his fur. Dogs don't forget smells, sounds, faces, Frank said. He saw Price. The mercenary coughed again. You're wasting time. Price isn't just a name. He's got teeth. Soldiers. Contracts. Government shields. Ellis walked toward him. And now he's got a problem. Us. The man laughed again, bitter. You think the law can touch him? No, Frank said. But we're not the law. Ellis looked up, surprised. Frank's jaw tightened. We're family. And this is personal. They called in a federal contact Ellis trusted. Someone outside Fort Ridge jurisdiction. The mercenary would be extracted under protective custody, his confession secured on audio. It wasn't justice yet, but it was proof. As the chopper approached through the twilight, snow rising like ash, Frank stood beside Kairo. He whispered, "You did good, soldier." The dog blinked once. Behind them, Aria stood quietly with the photo of her mother. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But something in her had shifted. A breath uncoiled. A silence. Released. The snow hadn't let up. Thick drifts curled along the sides of the Beckett barn, blanketing the fence posts in silence. The wind carried whispers through the slats, but inside, the warmth of a dim lantern cast flickering halos across the wooden walls. Frank was stacking firewood near the rear wall when he heard the crunch of footsteps. Too controlled, too even to be neighborly. He rose slowly, wiped his hands on his flannel, and stepped out of the barn just as the figure emerged from the fog. Black SUV. No headlights. Government plates. The man stepped out in a long coat, badge in hand, before he even closed the door. "Special Agent Levi Hart, FBI. I'm looking for Frank Beckett." Frank narrowed his eyes. "You've found him." The man extended the badge for a closer look. The name was right. The agency seal looked authentic. But something in the man's stance, too stiff, too rehearsed, pricked at Frank's veteran instincts. I was briefed about your daughter's involvement in a classified investigation. We'd like to debrief you and escort the evidence to a secure facility." His eyes scanned the barn behind Frank, then the house across the field. Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced to the right, where Kairo stood just beyond the barn door, watching, motionless. But his ears were flat, tail low, and the hair along his spine stood straight up. The last time Frank saw that posture, they were being shelled in Kandahar. "Agent Hart," Frank said calmly, "you travel alone?" "Backup's nearby." "Protocol," the man replied, smiling without warmth. Kairo growled low, a guttural primal warning that stopped even the wind. The man's eyes flicked down. "That dog military?" Frank didn't flinch. "Retired. Smarter than me most days." The man moved toward the barn entrance. "I'll need to see the hard drive, the one labeled DOJ only." Frank stepped in his path. "It's not here." "You're obstructing a federal—" Kairo lunged. Not at the man's throat, at his hip. In one fluid motion, Kairo yanked something loose a holster. The agent had concealed a suppressed sidearm beneath his coat. Not regulation, no serial. The man shoved Frank back, weapon drawn. "You just signed your—" Two things happened at once. A shovel slammed into the man's arm. Frank, pivoting like he hadn't in 20 years, and Kairo struck again, this time taking the man down by the shoulder. They crashed hard to the barn floor, hay scattering like sparks. The man tried to twist free, but Kairo's teeth had clamped deep. Frank yanked the pistol from the attacker's grip and stepped back, panting. "You're no Fed!" The man coughed, blood at his lip. "Neither are you anymore." Kairo stood over him, growling low, body quivering but controlled. One wrong twitch and that growl would become something far worse. Ellis arrived 6 minutes later, sirens off. He cuffed the man, read him rights that likely meant nothing, and searched his coat. The badge was fake. The ID printed on cheap laminate. And inside his glove compartment, a second photo of Emily, circled in red ink. "I think Spectratech just broke protocol," Ellis muttered. Frank exhaled through his nose. "They're getting desperate. Or they know what we're about to uncover." Inside the barn, Aria stood beside Kairo, one hand pressed gently to the side of his jaw. Her eyes were wide, but not afraid. She had seen too much to be afraid. Frank stepped to her side. "He knew." She nodded. "He always knows." Later that night, with the imposter secured in county lockup and the hard drive hidden in a safety deposit box miles away, Frank sat on the barn steps beside Kairo. The moon cast pale light across the fields, and the air smelled like frozen wood and old secrets. "I owe you again," Frank whispered. Kairo didn't move, just blinked, slowly, deliberately. Frank sighed. "You're not just remembering what they did. You're predicting what they'll do next." From the doorway, Aria watched them. And for the first time, she smiled. Not wide, not bright, but enough to make the frost crack just a little. Snowfall softened the world, but beneath that silence, something violent stirred. The fields behind the Beckett Ranch were glazed with moonlight, bare trees reaching like the ribs of forgotten giants. Frank had posted Sheriff Ellis near the back perimeter, and Kairo had been pacing all night, his movements tight, precise, like he knew the weather wasn't the only thing coming. Inside the house, Aria stood at the window, her hand resting on the glass. She hadn't drawn that day, hadn't spoken, Her stillness said everything Kairo already felt in his bones. Then, the snap of a branch. Too close. Frank dropped the mug in his hand. Down! The glass shattered as the first bullet tore through the front window. Frank tackled Aria, shielding her with his body. Kairo was already moving low, fast, silent as a shadow through snow. Another shot. This one clipped the railing near the porch. From the tree line, muzzle flashes bloomed like fireflies. Not random, not wild, tactical. Frank rolled to the hallway, grabbed the shotgun from behind the door. Aria crawled behind the sofa, arms around Kairo's medical kit, but Kairo didn't stay down. He moved, out the back, toward the gunfire. In the clearing beyond the barn, Sheriff Ellis fired 2 quick shots. One missed, the other didn't. A man in black dropped hard into the snow, his weapon tumbling from his hand. Frank joined him. How many? 3, maybe 4. Then they heard it, not the sharp crack of rifles, but something else. Kairo's bark, followed by a scream. Frank didn't wait. He charged into the tree line, breath searing his lungs, shotgun steady. The sound of struggle grew louder. Snarls, footsteps, a shout cut short. Then he saw them. 2 attackers, one bleeding from the arm, one turning his rifle toward something low to the ground. Kairo. Frank fired. The first man went down. The second fired back, a wild arc. Frank ducked. The bullet cracked through the bark beside him. Kairo lunged, despite the blood already darkening his left flank. He knocked the rifle loose, bit hard into the man's thigh. The attacker screamed, falling backward into a drift. Frank didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance, kicked the rifle away, and leveled the shotgun at the man's chest. "No more surprises," Frank growled. Red and blue lights lit the forest like a dream. Real ones this time. 3 black SUVs, tactical vests, real FBI agents this time, names that matched faces, weapons that had barcodes, words that didn't sound like rehearsed scripts. The leader, Agent Ramirez, nodded at Frank. "We intercepted their comms. Spectratech was going to make this look like an accident. Another fire." Frank gestured to Kairo, now lying on his side, panting hard. "They didn't count on him." Ramirez knelt beside the dog. "This is the shepherd? The one in the DOJ logs?" Aria stepped forward, hands balled at her sides. "His name is Kairo," she whispered. "He didn't forget what they did." Ramirez blinked. "Neither will we." At dawn, the field was roped off in crime scene tape. Bodies had been bagged, weapons logged. But something shifted. Inside the house, Agent Ramirez returned with a sealed envelope stamped DOJ. He handed it to Frank. "This makes it official. Kairo's been named critical evidence custodian in a federal investigation. No one touches him without DOJ clearance, not local, not state, not even us. He's not a pet. He's a witness." Frank looked at Kairo, who was being bandaged by a field medic calm, alert, still watching Aria. "I never thought a dog could carry a case," Ramirez added. "But this one, he's not just evidence, he's the case." Aria looked at Frank. Then she knelt beside Kairo and whispered, "We're not done, are we?" Kairo, through the haze of pain, gave one slow wag of his tail. The answer was clear. The courtroom was cold, not from temperature, but from the heavy silence. Marble walls loomed, the seal of the U.S. Justice Department watching over. Rows filled with agents, journalists, and strangers who didn't know her name 2 weeks ago, but now knew why she was here. Frank sat motionless in the gallery. Beside Aria, Kairo stood scarred, limping slightly, still watching everything. "Witness, please approach." Aria walked forward. small, pale, but steady. Kairo sat at her feet. "Do you understand you are under oath?" the judge asked. She nodded. Delgado, the prosecutor, spoke gently. "Can you tell the court what you remember?" Aria placed a folded photo of her family on the rail. "I remember the sound. 2 crashes, ours, and another. A black truck. It didn't stop. He looked in the car, said, 'It's done.'" Gasps. "Your Honor, we submit the photo found on Mr. Price's person," Delgado said. The defense attorney rose. "Miss Beckett, isn't it possible your memory is a trauma response?" Aria turned to Kairo. "No. He remembered with me." She stepped down, passing Price. Kairo slowed, locked eyes with him. Price looked away first. Frank met her at the bottom of the steps. "You were brave." She took his hand for the first time in years. At Quantico, the flash drive's contents played on a loop. "If you're hearing this, something went wrong. My name is Emily Beckett. I documented unethical weapons development at Spectratech. Follow Kairo." Grainy footage, names, dates, emails between Spectratech and Pentagon contacts. "Leverage Emily. She's got a kid. Remind her." By noon, federal indictments were issued. Arrest teams moved. Kerr was found in a panic room, trying to erase files already mirrored. Guilty pleas followed. Kerr, Price, Henley, Shaw. The judge's voice was steady as she read the verdict. "This court finds you guilty on all counts." Frank's fists trembled, not with rage, but release. Sheriff Ellis whispered, "Took 'em long enough." Aria stood, looking at the men who ended her family. No monsters, just suits behind stacks of evidence. Emily's voice had played, "If anything happens to me, follow Kairo." The judge continued, "Life without parole. You undermined national security and public trust." Price showed no reaction, except a flicker of recognition toward Aria. She spoke clearly. "Mom can rest now." Kairo lifted his head, as if acknowledging her words. Outside, reporters clamored, "Life sentences for Spectratech conspirators. Dog who brought down the giants." But Aria didn't hear. She walked with Kairo, hand resting on his back. "We should plant flowers on Mom's grave this spring," she told Frank. He nodded, choked up. That night, the ranch felt like home again. Emily and Mason's photo rested above the fireplace, not as a memorial, but a promise. Kairo lay near the hearth, the warmth meeting his tired bones. He wasn't young anymore, but in that moment he was enough, because the silence that once ruled their world was gone, and in its place was voice. The knock came early. Not the kind that asks permission, the kind that expects obedience. Frank Beckett opened the door to find 2 men in dark coats. One flashed a badge, the other stood with military rigidity. "Mr. Beckett?" the taller one asked. Frank didn't answer. "We're here regarding K9 Unit Echo 9. Codename Kairo. There's been a review. Technically, he remains federal property." Frank's knuckles whitened against the door frame. Inside, Aria traced the healed patch on Kairo's shoulder. The dog sensed the tension. "What do you mean, property?" Frank's voice was low but steel strong. Kairo was part of Operation Spectra. Though the program's shut down, the asset is still listed under DoD authority. Aria appeared, breath catching. The word asset burned through her. Kairo rose, pressing beside her protectively. "She's 10, Frank said. "That dog is the reason she's alive. You think I'll hand him over because some file says so? The agent shifted. Kairo was exposed to Spectratech. And saved us, Frank cut in. Aria stepped forward, trembling but fierce. He's not yours. He came back for me, when no one else did. Kairo stepped between her and the agents, protective. Frank grabbed a file and threw it at them. Veterinary documentation, psychological service designation, witness protection certification. He's been reassigned as Aria's service dog, permanently. That's irregular, the agent said. So was Spectratech. Frank's voice sharpened. You don't get to vanish people and take back the only thing they left. The men exchanged glances. We'll escalate this. You do that, Frank said. Bring lawyers. Bring cameras. He slammed the door. Inside, the silence felt held, not cold. Aria dropped to her knees, wrapped Kairo in her arms. Kairo leaned in, heavy with trust. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside was a home no longer waiting to be taken. The Federal Review Room smelled of old paper and newer judgment. Frank sat beside Aria. Across, a panel shuffled files. Kairo's life reduced to bullet points. Kairo sat at Aria's feet, still, knowing this battlefield was of words and truth. A woman entered, tall, calm, precise. Dr. Ella Harlow, behavioral veterinary specialist. She stood in the room's center. I asked for 5 minutes. I'll need 3. She turned to Aria, to Kairo, then to the room. I met Echo 9 4 years ago after a convoy breach, torn ligaments, shattered ribs, and eyes that never came home. She held up thin notes. Kairo became neither tool nor ghost. Loyal, operational, but changed. When Captain Vance died, Kairo went missing. We thought it was desertion. It wasn't. He was running toward something. She faced Aria. I visited unannounced. Kairo was alert, gentle, protective. In 23 years, I've never seen clearer post-trauma healing for both human and canine than this bond. She placed her file on the table. Remove him and Aria will regress. This is not a pet or equipment. This is a living lifeline. Silence. If you care about healing, not hierarchy, you know the answer. As she left, she paused beside Kairo. Good boy. Still doing the work no one else can. Kairo's tail gave a soft thump. Outside, snow melted. Inside, hearts thawed too. The flag outside the courthouse hung at half-mast. Inside, a quiet chamber honored not the fallen, but the living. Frank in an awkward tie. Aria in a neat coat, eyes on Kairo. Kairo stood proud, ears forward, scarred but indestructible in that moment. A Marine officer spoke. For exemplary service in combat and civilian recovery, we grant honorable discharge to K9 Echo 9. Codename Kairo. A velvet box held the Combat Valor Medal. Fidelis usque ad mortem, loyal until death. The Marine knelt, fastening the ribbon around Kairo's neck. The room rose. Applause thundered. But Kairo didn't move until Aria stepped forward. She wrapped her arms around him. You're home, she whispered. Kairo leaned into her, like a house settling onto its foundation after years of standing guard. Frank turned away, blinking back tears. No more legal battles. No more memos. The verdict had been written in loyalty. This wasn't discharge. It was restoration. That night, on the farm, the medal hung by the hearth. Kairo lay curled on the quilt, Aria's hand on his chest. Outside, snow melted into earth. Inside, silence melted into peace. Spring came quietly that year. No grand bloom, just the slow drip of snow turning to water, the creak of branches shedding ice, and a faint scent of lemon balm from a garden that hadn't grown in 2 years. Inside, the kettle whistled softly. Frank poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for Aria. She sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling furiously. Writing had become her language, like Cairo's silent loyalty. Stories flowed from her small hands of a hero with 4 paws and a heart too big for war. Kairo lay beside her, tail thumping gently, always watching. A knock broke the moment. A young woman handed Frank a registered delivery from New York. Aria held the envelope, scanning the sender. Northlight Books. Inside was a letter on thick ivory paper. Dear Miss Aria Beckett, your illustrated stories, Cairo's Quiet, have been accepted for publication in our Healing Hearts series. Your voice is not only brave, but necessary. Frank read it twice, pride and disbelief mingling. Aria stepped outside, pressing the envelope to her chest. Beneath the lemon tree, where blooms had returned after years, she knelt. Kairo followed, and there, Aria cried, not from pain, but relief. Because somehow the girl who hadn't spoken for years had found a way to speak to the world through a dog who couldn't talk either. And the world had listened. Later, as the sun dipped west, Aria brought Frank a single lemon-bright, imperfect, beautiful. She placed it in his hand and whispered, I want to plant another. The garden ceremony was simple, no speeches, no cameras, just people who had seen too much and survived. 2 plaques stood side by side, Emily Beckett and Captain Mason Vance. Beneath, by Aria's choice, Truth doesn't die, it plants itself. Aria chose every flower-white lilacs for memory, daffodils for courage, forget-me-nots like whispers. Frank dug every inch with his own hands. As guests left in silence, Aria stayed. Kairo lay beside her, calm, protective. She placed a folded story beneath Emily's plaque and whispered, Mom, he still remembers the beach. Then she turned to Mason's, leaving a sketch of a man and dog. Thank you for giving him back to me, she said, voice steady. No tears, just witness. In the days that followed, Aria returned often, sometimes with a story, sometimes with questions only the wind could answer. Once she left lemonade by the plaque. Just in case you're thirsty, she'd said. Frank watched quietly. On stormy nights, he'd kneel there too, hand on stone, remembering that healing wasn't forgetting. It was returning, planting, blooming again. One golden afternoon, Aria sat barefoot on the porch swing, hair still damp from chasing Kairo through the creek. Frank sanded an old chair, hands needing the work. Kairo lay at the steps, one eye closed, the other half open, watching. Grandpa? Aria said softly. Yeah, sweetheart? Do you think he knew where he was going that first day? Frank smiled, remembering that snowy morning. He didn't come looking for answers. He came for you. Aria's eyes widened, not in disbelief, but understanding. They sat in the quiet, no need to fill it. As the sun sank, Kairo climbed the steps, nudged Aria's hand, and settled beside her. You remember what the judge called him? Frank asked. A hero. Before that, she frowned, thinking. The last sentinel, Frank said. Aria whispered the words like a spell. Kairo thumped his tail once and rested his head on her lap. Because what mattered wasn't medals or courts. It was that when a little girl was drowning in silence, he came. Not because anyone ordered him to, but because he knew he was needed. That evening, as stars appeared, Aria leaned into Kairo and whispered, "Thanks for choosing us." And Frank believed it too. Some sentinels don't guard borders. They guard what's left after everything breaks. And if you're lucky, they find their way home. In a world that often moves too fast to notice quiet miracles, the story of Kairo and Aria reminds us of something enduring. Love, real love, doesn't need words. It waits, it listens, it finds you when you've forgotten how to be found. German shepherds like Kairo aren't just dogs. They're protectors of more than homes. They guard hearts. Their loyalty doesn't end when the mission is over. Sometimes their greatest act of service begins after the gunfire fades, when they help us piece together what was broken, not with force, but with presence. This story is a testament to the healing that can only happen when trust is rebuilt, step by step, paw by paw. It honors not only the courage of those who serve, but the quiet strength of those who stay. And it speaks to every child, every veteran, every person carrying silent pain. There is hope. There is connection. And sometimes that hope walks on 4 legs and shows up on your doorstep wounded but unbroken. May we continue to value the lives we're given, the animals who walk beside us, and the second chances we never saw coming. Because sometimes love doesn't bark, it just stays.